Hello everyone, today we talk about the 17th century Polish army organization. So unfortunately no, this is not gonna be a video about the winged Hussars, unfortunately. I promise I will make that one day, also because I like the topic in itself, and I know, and this is not gonna be actually even about the Polish tactics in the 17th century. It's gonna be more about, in fact, the organization, as we said. I know it's plenty of videos out there that are so cool because they emphasize, how the warrior fought individually, what the equipment was of a single soldier and all. But as a matter of fact, we're not here to comb the lices, and I think that military history is really something that has to be understood in a broader fashion, not just about the single individual, but actually everything that could support that individual on the battlefield and to make it able to field it, to feed it, etc. And also about the organization of the armies of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There is a freaking lot to say also in terms of individual military traditions, because as we will see here, it wasn't just a Polish thing. It was actually a pretty multi-ethnical army with lots of hybrid between several military cultures, and this is what conferred really the Polish army at the time such a great effectiveness, despite being really unique in its own in itself, especially compared to the other Western armies of the time. So I think this is gonna be a pretty long video, and I hope at least you're gonna appreciate it. If I will be able to tell it right. So at this time, just for a bit of context, Poland was the chief power in Eastern Europe. So it possessed these territories stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and from Pomerania in the west to the Don River in the east. So an enormous land, territorially speaking, that, by the way, also from a strategical point of view, organized the Polish forces in a in a way that was functional for this to the strategical mobility. By the way, Poland was intensively at war in this period in here. I will make, by the way, on the time, here we are in the 17th century. I decided to split it from the 16th for another video, because there have been certain relatively substantial modifications to the Polish-Lithuanian armed forces that are worth of the mention for another video. So the thing is already complicated, enough complicated the way it is. There's gonna be just a little bit of maybe the late 16th century from the 80s and the 90s, but this is mostly 17th century and something from even the beginning of the 18th. And who knows, maybe up to now I haven't ventured into the 18th century yet, at least not much, but I plan to do it sooner or later. So this is just, however, part of my early modern era times. Excuse me, I drink a little before I go on. Here we go. So I'm gonna say Polish now all the time for the sake of brevity, but obviously this was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So something very I have to make a video about its genesis in medieval times, because that's an important chapter of European history. So I will say Polish, but don't take it, in the contemporary national meaning of the word, of course. As I was saying before, the Polish, the organization, tactics, appearance, especially. It was a bit of the Polish organization combined essentially tactics and weapons from the east and the west. So they added even this traditional Polish, you know, dash and gallantry. You have to think of being this a very chivalric society broadly meant. We don't have time to talk to detail now about Polish society aside from the military, strictly military point of view, but there would be a lot to add relatively to this. And throughout this time, throughout the early modern era, the Polish armies defeated successfully the Muscovites, the Cossacks, the Tatars, the Ottomans, the Germans, the Danish, the Swedes, the Wallachians. So actually a great deal of peoples that were obviously surrounding Poland. You can argue that every country at times basically fought with every single neighbor that was in there, especially such a large state like the Polish-Lithuanian one was naturally bordering very different, very diverse countries with very diverse military traditions, from which the Polish army really drew a lot. And not just from this period, because I recently made a couple of videos about Polish history, also Slavic history, stressing how essentially Eastern Europe had always this continuous a great deal of problem with Eastern Europe is that it didn't really have a real frontier. The borders were really quite fluctuating. The Slavic communities were always in contact with these other peoples of the steppes. There was a lot of ethnical mix as well. Steppes peoples were settled, as a matter of fact, also into the now sedentarized Slavic world. So there was a lot of mix that arrived basically up to the gates of Germany in terms of and there are in fact many characteristics of the Polish army really owe a lot to these Eastern influences, especially to mounted fighters that had a crucial role. So even certain great transformations that occurred in Western military history, think about the military reforms of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, actually owe a lot to the lessons that, in that case, the Swedes learned in warfare against the Poles, and also suffering certain very heavy defeats against them. Before I was saying it's a pity we're not gonna discuss basically the winged hussars by themselves today, but just to make you understand that what basically had become the standard Western military pike-and-shot tactics, with these squares of pikemen supported by arquebusiers, etc. Well, this was bypassed by the Poles simply with their well, not so simply, but pretty effectively at least, with their longer hussars lances that actually were sometimes even longer than the same Western pikemen, foot pikemen, and therefore the winged hussars were knights that could charge even into the straight into the Western pike squares, and even managing to break them in that way. So definitely an anachronism, because the Polish cavalry in this sense was anachronistic, but it's one of the few and pretty amazing anachronisms of great success in military history. Just this is a lesson against progressivism and all the myths concerning the technologism that wins over everything. No, it's really the doctrine, and that's the only thing that makes the real difference in war. So as I was hinting at before, today's Poland is a country that emerges from pretty dramatic history in many ways, from the terrible times that were triggered a little bit in the whole European continent with the rise of nationalisms in the 19th century and of dictatorships in the 20th. So Polish history is actually very fascinating and really much overlooked. And let's say that as a consequence, today's Poland, aside from not being even territorially speaking the Poland that we're discussing by the 17th century, geographically, let's say, is essentially a Slavic country, a Catholic country. In the 17th century, this wasn't true, because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that definitely encompassed many more lands than just, you know, what was at the time Poland, was extremely varied. And there were Slavs, Lithuanians, Balts, Germans, Tartars, even communities of Armenian and Jewish traders. There was seemingly at a point an extremely large settlement of Scots, 37,000 according to modern estimates. And these peoples naturally had all their own languages, their own religions, their own confessions. Talking to language, naturally Slavic languages are also pretty diverse. There was Polish, Great Russian, Ruthenian, Kashub, I believe it's called, Goralski. And so every part of the Commonwealth, basically, even in the Slavic areas, spoke sort of different languages. Well, yeah, pretty still similar, but still, you know, we're talking about a different world from the one we live now. That is essentially still a nation-state world. At the time, it wasn't really like that. It was in the Ancien Regime, everything was much more individualistic in many ways, and much more communitary in others. So this is especially the 17th century, also relatively to religion, is a very important part of this, because as we've seen at the time also, think about the Inquisition in Spain, or the wars of religions in France with great massacres of Protestants, etc. And instead, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was very tolerant from a religious point of view, so this was also a plus, because it basically also for other, as it was true also for other countries, it allowed. Just recently I made a video about the Dragoon Guard, so that tells how eventually the French Huguenots, in that case, eventually went emigrated from France, going to Eastern Europe as well, sometimes as well. So this is not maybe so important, but all this variety of cultures actually had a very strong, was strongly reflected within the Polish army in itself. So alongside these predominant force of Polish and Lithuanian Hussars that are so, you know, probably one of the most fearsome and beautiful at the same time cavalry in history, probably even the strongest one. Let's be honest. Someone is at least for the times. There were lots of foreigners that served within the Commonwealth. So we're talking sometimes even about the same enemies that the Poles were fighting at the time. So we have to think about the Tartars, the Cossacks, the Wallachians, the Transylvanians, the Moldavians, the Hungarians, Serbians, Albanians, and there were also a lot of really of nationalities coming from the West. So a lot of Polish soldiers were, as a matter of fact, French, Italian, Dutch, Walloon, Swedish, Scottish. So really also you have to think of this really into the in terms really of culture and that all these implied. Sometimes military history is heinously you know, brushed up in popular culture by saying, "Oh, look at how that nationality was cool because those were that national." No, actually, these armies were all multicultural, very strongly multicultural, and this was the average that would remain essentially up to the 19th century. Even 18th century, say, national armies were, as a matter of fact, made up of all these desperates and you know, criminals that were collected from the whole Europe. You don't have to think about the soldiers of Frederick the Great as just Prussians. There were lots of other Germans, of Frenchmen, of Polish, of Italians, so it was everything like that. So just to tell you that military, you know, the warfare has really no color. Warfare is something human, and it works with human material that you can, by the way, also shape in your own fashion, as long as it works. And nationality in this sense was not a concern, really, nor languages, because even if in the military communication is excruciatingly important, however, these guys were told even naturally to understand the orders in the language of the army, etc. But this, whatever, these are things we will have lots of time, if I live long enough, to talk about on this channel. So the greatest influence in Polish warfare, actually, and I've been discussing this also recently in the video I made about Polish medieval Polish tactics in the essentially the low Middle Ages, was from the Holy Roman Empire. So it was mostly a German influence, and German warfare was always very influential on the Polish one. And this is something you can evidently see on even on the military vocabulary, on the lexicon that was used at the time. At the time, the main languages of war were French, German, and Italian. So many, you find lots of transliterations of terms, especially in Poland, of German terms that sound basically almost the same, that they're just superficially Slavicized. And that tells you, since a very early age, by the way, think about the term, I'm not sure whether I pronounce it well in Polish or not, so Polish audience, please forgive me. Rycer, sorry, that it would be the German Reiter, that is for the cavalry. It was the cavalryman. So for saying, for instance, so Poland obviously in late medieval times had feudalized alongside the Western models. It had fit since the times of the evangelization into the Western world, in the Catholic world, differently from Russia. For example, Lithuania, now that was the other major branch of the Polish, in fact, Lithuanian Commonwealth, had been wavering a bit. Then it decided to stick with the Poles and not with the Muscovites. So they fitted into that as well. So today I would like to talk essentially about how the Polish army was really composed, and the various bodies of troops that you could find there. So, keeping to talk about the German influence, there was a lot of German infantry used into Poland at the time. So these were German mercenaries. There were regiments of paid volunteers. So people who simply sold their services around, like in other areas of of Europe. These were a fully Western infantry, which means that they fought they were well-trained troops. They fought in the typical Pike-and-Shot fashion of early modern Western Europe. So these were there was the regiment. There were also Polish regiments, telling the truth, of infantry, but seemingly these were a bit larger in number, even though as an average, like a 10% was composed of the so-called dead men, because there was there were people who, yeah, that they figured in the registers of the regiment, but that never showed up. And this a regiment counted 1,500, was divided in 12 companies normally. So these were essentially the heaviest kind of infantry you could find in practice at the time, and also the most effective. So as I was saying, for Western standards, it was pretty average. Whereas in Poland and in the broader Commonwealth, the thing was a bit more rare. Not because these tactics did not exist at all. Since the 16th century, pike-and-shot tactics are used all over Europe up to the Muscovite state. But the great deal of problem of these troops is that were required a sort of an organization that sometimes required also a political and social basis that in Eastern Europe tended to lack a little bit. This because Eastern Europe was a bit different. It was generally a less advanced world compared to the West. Also, technologically speaking, we will see it later, they lagged a bit behind the West, but this was not a big deal of importance. I mean, the Polish armed forces compensated that with, as we've seen, extremely effective military material, let's say. But let's say that while such infantries were present in the West, they were completely replenishable. It was basically the only way at that point at which infantries fought. For the East, it was a bit more difficult to organize that, so it was much more convenient, by certain standards, to just hire these mercenaries. And today we're talking about the 17th century, so a moment that saw actually a great rise in mercenarism, especially during the time of the 30 Years' War. So there were always lots of people who were up there in arms, and they were pretty experienced, and that was also why such mercenaries were so prized. Today I will try to not to talk about strict say other history that has nothing to do with the organization of the Polish army, but you have to think that Poland was the story of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is extremely complicated. Let's just say that it was a major player also in the Western politics, international politics, and there was constant warfare. So these contacts with the West weren't, it's not that the West was in one side and the East from the other. They were completely, in contact, and therefore the hiring of such mercenaries was something normal, let's say, in Polish history since a very early age. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So, in this sense, German infantry was also a model for the progressive modernization and westernization, let's say better, of the Polish army. John III Sobieski, better known as Jan Sobieski, he led the greatest cavalry charge in history under the walls of Vienna against the Ottoman besiegers. So also in here we don't have time really to discuss the single individual characters and their stories. We are essentially, his reign in Poland was from 1674 to 1696, so we are at the very end of our period. Had realized by that point that the West had still to, a lot of things to teach Poland in terms of, especially military technology. For instance, so as I was saying before, Poland had perfectly Western tactics and equipment, etc. at this point, but they were used sometimes in different ways. For instance, grenades, hand grenades, were used seemingly in a different fashion that was in the West. Especially certain sources from the 1660s suggest that basically the Poles used hand grenades in a bit of a different way from what was usually done in the West. In the West, grenades were mostly used at that time to storm in siege warfare. So especially in closed environments, to make blow up certain rooms during the assaults at fortresses and all, and etc. Then eventually, if I'm not wrong, towards the end of the 17th century, the hand grenades kind of declined into Western warfare to reappear. To be revived. Actually, I think in the mid of the 18th, for reasons that now we can't explain. Seemingly, by the second half of the 17th century, the Poles used instead hand grenades for halting cavalry charges. That is something very interesting, because from one side, it tells we don't have to take this as if the Poles didn't know how to use them. I think, on the contrary, if we have such evidence, the Poles had adapted the use of hand grenades into in their warfare. There was differently, and also seeing a greater deal of cavalry warfare, especially out there in these very open spaces. Now it's kind of a pretty abstract concept, but let's say that siege warfare was much more intense into the West. Into the Eastern Europe, it was mostly open field battles in these plains. So cavalry warfare was much more there, traditionally speaking. So this is interesting, because I would like to read those sources. By the way, I'm telling this from reading from certain studies, telling the truth. But I would love to have seen really how these grenades were used in cavalry to halt cavalry charges, because it reminds me of really of how eventually these grenades were used in the West from the mid of the 18th century. That is essentially to deploy the grenadiers. Obviously, hand grenades were kept being used in assaulting fortifications, etc. But it was normal for 18th century warfare to deploy in square, especially against cavalry. Actually, only against cavalry most of the times, and positioning the grenadiers on the corners of the formation, because the corner of the formations were the most vulnerable sides, and therefore basically creating this deterrent posed by the grenade to avoid enemies attacking from that side. And this was conceived mostly against even cavalry assaults, because the square was done in that situation, because in the West, in Western warfare, cavalry comes back strongly on the fields during the 18th century, when basically the pikes disappear from the battlefields, and therefore cavalry comes back to be effective from this moment, especially of the 16th century, to which its shock power especially had been reduced by the squares of pikemen, etc. So, and by the way, also thanks to the Polish influence, because Gustavus Adolphus, that we mentioned before, reformed the Swedish army in this sense, giving much more importance to cavalry, to what previously was done in Western tactics, in early, say, in Renaissance Western tactics. And what is interesting about this use of the grenades is it's as if the Poles had procured this anti-cavalry use, I mean, to halt the cavalry charges through grenades before the West. But this obviously is always a matter of context, and we should have seen how even widespread was the use of grenades into Polish armies in open field against and how effective really to halt cavalry charges by that time. Because well, there are many considerations now. We can't. I don't have the luxury now of time to discuss them, but I think we will over time. So relatively to the lagging of Polish technology compared to the West, we have to see that also flintlock muskets were introduced relatively slowly. Even though flintlock muskets were used by almost all the Dragoons, we will talk about them later, and especially the newly formed grenadier companies in Poland by the beginning of the 18th century, it seems that matchlocks were still in use in large scale before 1707, when the army was reformed. And this is kind of interesting because this in Europe had happened already since the 60s of the 17th century. So it's a good half of a century backwards in some ways. But once again, we don't have to be particularly concerned about technology. This is what I'm telling all the times I talk military history, because it's not really technology that makes the difference, but doctrine. Fix this in your mind, because that's really what the point is. And this thing seems to have happened also for bayonets. Now, you know that bayonets were essentially introduced by Vauban, especially the particular type with the sleeve, basically sleeved over the muzzle. So this was done in the I think it was introduced in the French army in 1688. But at the same time, just to tell you how technology is not really important, that was very late also for French standards. The army of Louis XIV were the greatest in Europe at the time, but they were also the ones that adopted technology, developed technology in a longer time. So just for telling you how this happens, because especially when you have big armies like the French one, it's not really about the technology that makes the difference, but about the organization. It's a bit like with I always make this example in our times. If you take the United States armed forces, you realize that on average, in terms of relatively to quantity, American troops are less technological than, say, other Western armies. But this is simply because other Western armies are very, very small, so they can't concentrate technology into that. Obviously, but the only army that is pretty effective today in the world that can do so is definitely the U.S. Army. So this has nothing to do with technology, not even actually with the knowledge that you have, because it's not that the United States doesn't have technological knowledge. On the contrary, and they have a lot of research into the field. But simply they cannot afford it for such a large military like they have on such an extensive base. Whereas if our European armies now had to fight a war, they couldn't they couldn't go on for more than some week with the degree of technology that is with which our soldiers are equipped for the smaller, say, surgical missions that they are mostly used for. So this is how really technology works. It doesn't take to have the best technology to win a war. It doesn't. And military history proves this with a on a regular basis, as a matter of fact. However, this doesn't also mean that technology is completely useless. The importance is really how you use it, and which. So even in the case of the bayonet, yeah, the Poles seemingly adapted it pretty late compared to other Western armies, but hey, even the army of the Sun King was the strongest army at the time in Europe, lagged behind the other Westerners. So what's the point, really? We have discussed about German infantry. Now let's talk also about German cavalry, because the contribution of German style cavalry, also in here I say German cavalry, but we don't have it to it's more the type of cavalry. It's not that these guys were necessarily German. They could be Bohemian, they could be Swedish, they could be French, they could be Italian, they could be every kind of but it was really German style, you know, that the Germans had kind of pioneered, especially during the 16th century, certain cavalry tactics, the caracol and stuff like that. Now, by the 17th century, you know, we have practically overlooked the importance the German-style cavalry fighting had in the Polish armies, even up to a very few years ago. So instead, we know that Polish commanders had a great regard for their German cavalry, and they esteemed them very, very highly. So in the 50s of the 17th century, the Grand Duke John Casimir Vasa, he ruled from 1648 to 1668, preferred, as a matter of fact, the German cavalry to the same Polish Hussars. So this is pretty meaningful. This is especially after the Polish disaster at Bati of 1652 against the Cossacks. John Casimir began to pay the German cavalry even more than the Polish Hussars themselves. And not just a few, like it was 16.5 zlotys per quarter compared to the 41 was usually done for the quarter in the Polish army. So a good, even more than 50%. When you study about you know, especially how the pays of mercenaries, you have always to look at how really they were paid, because there are many prejudices in history on how troops were regarded that really are dispelled by just observing at that. I mean, if a unit was paid more than another, it was because it was considered more effective and more at least. So yeah, there could be certain other reasons for it, but when we're talking about these mercenaries that could be found all around, they didn't have any particular political affiliation but money. Let's say that's what you have to find out. And for, let's say, between the 50s and especially the beginning of the beginning of the 60s of the 17th century, it seems the German cavalry and Polish army even outnumbered the Hussars by a considerable margin. This is also very important, which, by the way, tells you really about the availability of such German cavalry. The Hussars were basically the backbone of the Polish army, and were fielded not just by the king. After we will see about actually about the so-called royal guard, etc. But they were fielded basically by any Polish magnate, even as a private commander, let's say. So that tells you how extensively really were German cavalrymen used by the Poles. So obviously these cavalry was usually different from the eastern ones. Aside from the Hussars that were coerced most of the times, I mean the winged ones, at least the heaviest ones. But let's say that also in here, yeah, don't make me say too much, but let's say that there was a different type of cavalry. The Germans rode these heavy Frisian horses, unlike the lighter and hot-blooded ones of the Hussars, and they were equipped in Western style, even in not just in armor but also in this fashion. Sometimes you have these large broad rim felt caps, like in the Swedish. If you have an idea of the Swedish army at the time, you kind of have an idea. These boots, this other, yeah, I know I'm going it a bit superficially because obviously also other cavalry used boots. I didn't want to make it of a distinguishing factor, but the look is also important on the clothing especially. So you could distinguish that type of cavalry from the more traditional Polish-Lithuanian ones. And many of these German cavalry were actually cuirassed. They were cuirassiers, really fully, and this is normal, especially in the first half of the 17th century. But from the 40s of the 17th century, armor begins to decline. This had been the average thing, that essentially cavalry, as we've seen in Renaissance warfare, tended to be in the West at least, to shrink in numbers and to get more heavily armored, because there were there wasn't much room for them with all those pikes around. And fire was pretty serious, so that was the general solution. As a matter of fact, there are lots of prejudices relatively to the use of cavalry at this time. So it's not that during Renaissance warfare cavalry didn't have an importance at all. Even the idea that, especially in the mid of the 16th century, there were only caracole tactics being performed, so with cavalry, as a matter of fact, just coming a few meters from the pikemen, shooting or unloading their wheel-lock pistols against them and then retreating and not engaging into hand-to-hand combat is false, because cavalry kept charging, and actually the caracole was meant exactly to prepare, to soften up the enemy formation to eventually charge into it. So there is a bit of and this kind of happening of a weighting, let's say, of the cavalry armor is something that remains, in fact, up to the end of the 30 Years' War. So you see, even in the English Civil War, there were armor, full body armor. Well, at that time it was already declining a little bit. In fact, that's a good example how progressively armor went disappearing, but the concept of the full plate armor to defend yourself from bullets was still there. Then eventually firearms technology accelerates brutally, and it was seen that basically all that armor on was useless, extremely expensive, and at that point it was much better to have a lighter cavalry that could perform, in this sense, more dynamic tasks. And even if they were vulnerable to bullets, they still were more effective into combat and killing more enemies than what they could do with all that armor on, and saving maybe the price of all that armor for buying muskets that were, in this sense, effectively equally, if not more at that point, from your own side. So this is a bit how the thing evolved. So also in Polish armies you see that, so that especially these Western style cavalry began getting lighter and more dynamic, by the way. So that is also thanks, in fact, to the Swedish military reforms of Gustavus Adolphus. Also artillery kind of improved sensibly in this sense. So the warfare was getting a bit more dynamic than what it had been during the Renaissance one. And cavalry had this increasing need for speed, for mobility, And in this sense, the Poles were advantaged because they could field, we'll see it later, some of the best light cavalries that were around at the time. So what is also very interesting about this is that we sense sometimes that the Polish winged Hussars were only a shock cavalry. So that their main task was charging straight at the enemy with their very long lances and performing these devastating cavalry charges that in fact routed an awful lot of enemies at the time, even with very small numbers. And especially if you see about the Ottoman incursions into Moldavia, etc., the Poles were able to defeat huge Ottoman armies with a very few men, and this got repeated over and over and over again. So it's just not that happened once. So that really tells you about the shock effectiveness of the Polish Hussars. But as it always happens when you have such great professionals of war, these people had also pretty flexible and an open mindset, and especially it seems that the Hussars, even the winged Hussars, were extremely fond of firearms. So there were many mounted arquebusiers even among the Hussars. There is the Bassano engraving from Michal K. Radziwiłł, I think it's said, that of Michal Radziwiłł entry into Vienna in 1679, depicting it, that actually identifies as arquebusiers certain Polish Hussars with armor and wings, and with arquebuses and without their lances. Actually, no, I think that arquebuses are not showed, but not lances are either. So I don't really know. By the way, there were generally two types of lances in dotation to the Hussars: a shorter one and a longer one. What I'm trying to say here is basically that Hussars made a very extensive use of firearms on horseback as well. And in fact, especially in the 90s of the 17th century, it became common for Hussar units to be converted into units of arquebusiers. So probably this didn't come from, a radical transformation of the type of unit, but arquebuses were pretty much used also before among the Hussars. So this really adds up to the flexibility of these heavy shock cavalry that could fight also to soften up the enemy ranks. This is kind of normal if you think about it, because also if you had been a Polish Hussar and you wanted to attack a Swedish square of pikemen, well, why not softening up it first with a bit of gunshots before charging straight in? So it kind of makes sense, and this shows in certain ways that also the Poles were in the traditional Polish cavalry. So without even talking about the Western mercenaries, was capable of performing similar tactics also to the one of the Caracol, and was a really very flexible unit in its employment. So now let's talk about Dragoons. There are also another very an essential part of the Polish army. So these troops were lighter troops, and they were mostly recruited in the eastern territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so that they were mostly Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians in fact formed the bulk of the Dragoon Records for the Polish army, and this was also a bit of a problem actually, because at a certain point they deserted en masse during the Cossack rebellions after 1648. So this might have been a backside of having a relying on very multi-ethnic troops Why the Ukrainians though? Well, because those area of the eastern provinces of the Commonwealth were pretty traditionally versed into these kind of dragoons combat. So in an account about the Vienna's campaign in 1683, these dragoons are described as horsemen who fit for every service of war, with musket and sword, first-rate pillagers. So this basically tells it all. This was a sort of medium or light cavalry, say better, chiefly because they could be also infantry. And so they were also in here pretty multitask as well, and you could use them for in fact here it says for every kind of eventuality. These were drawn from the peasantry, really, so they were that was the social extraction. So you can imagine where how really a Ukrainian peasant of the 17th century could be, fierce, skilled, pretty used to all this raid warfare and all, and by the way, pretty influenced also by the steppes tactics. We'll see it better later with the Zaporozhian Cossacks that were also largely Ukrainian, practically, and they so these were troops that were sent to do the most dangerous and unpleasant. To carry out the most dangerous and pleasant tasks, which the noble hussars and the even the Cossack elite really didn't want to do. The Cossacks weren't, we'll say it later, they weren't just these lightly armored or non-armored at all cavalry of the steppe. They were sometimes the so-called I think they were called Panzerni. So they were a Cossack-style cavalry unit. They're usually wearing mail shirts. Also in here, Panzerni actually is a Germanism. It comes from Panzer, so the armored cavalry in this case. So there was this kind of, you see that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth did a lot of co-optation of elites of various kind. So those were the elites, and the elites didn't want to do well, what the elites didn't want to do was performed by the dragoons. So this is also normal. You don't waste your best elite shock troops for carrying out tasks that involve a lot of attrition, a lot of danger, and also that require a lot of mobility. These dragoons were quite agile and mobile. The noble hussars and the Panzerni weren't. As a matter of fact, it would have been senseless to throw them away in all those operations of scouting, of guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and all, where speed was was a great requirement. And in fact, also the mounts of these troops were quite different. As always, the shock troops had heavier cavalry that got tired earlier. These dragoons mostly probably rode runners on these very hotly tempered breeds of the steppes for lighter exertions, let's say, for faster for running and really having greater resistance over time. Then definitely also in the steppes there were heavier horses as well. But those were actually bred into, the Poles had their own breds at home in this sense. They didn't need the one of the steppes. So the dragoons were really invaluable sometimes, and this especially considering what we're hinting at before, the huge distances that had to be covered when operating within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So these really thousands of kilometers sometimes as well, back and forth, and think of all the attacks, all the frontier warfare that existed on such an extended border, like the Polish one. So you needed these combat-ready troops that could be, first of all, mobilized immediately, and secondly, be sent quite speedily to reach the threat, the invasion. And Dragoons were the best for this. They scouted, they foraged, and dug as well. They constructed camps and bridges. So quite interestingly, and as it happens many times actually, these lighter, they're really extremely multitasking in here. They were also they worked also as pioneers, as you understand, and this was vital to increase also the strategical mobility. So, and for this reason, Dragoons were also equipped with axes that were issued generally as part of their own equipment that were needed to carry out these works of military engineering during the campaigns. And you can say that the Polish armies basically moved tanks to these Dragoons, literally. And so such multi-purpose soldiers were sometimes attached as independent, let's say, free companies to regiments either of infantry, cavalry, or artillery. This is very important because it tells you also a bit how they were conceived. Were a sort of a support troop for the heavier units that could, in fact, shield them also a bit to pave their road, and to act as a bit of a I don't even know how properly to say that, but something that could be used in every kind of situation to assess or to acknowledge what the situation was, to be sent in exploration, to really also being also the eyes and ears of these heavier units. This happens actually in all armies, especially at this time. You have the bulk of the armies. They're very also usually heavier troops that have a particular political and military cost, and then you have this, you can say, throwaway troops, but troops that are mostly meant to suffer attrition, that are also usually less expensive. So as we have seen, these troops came from the poorer areas of the Commonwealth, and they could be recruited quite simply in many ways. They were a bit unreliable, as we've seen as well, but they still did their job most of the times. So these troops actually were also infantry. Dragoons could mount and dismount. That was actually the deal of the Dragoons, that they could adapt to also adhere to every kind of terrain, any kind of tactical use. We have seen it before relatively to their equipment. They had a musket and a sword, so army weapons that you could use for also for combined tactics in part. Maybe some of the Dragoons in the same clash would fight on foot as musketeers, and the others would shield them as cavalry, using sabers and stuff. So by the mid 17th century, the Dragoons kept they began to abandon pikes, and they soon all basically get equipped with muskets. So this is also important because it was immediately realized from that time, also a bit earlier than in other areas of Europe, evidently, that pikes were kind of less useful, or at least they were declining. So having these old musket, these units equipped with muskets, also added a bit of flexibility. So this wasn't probably done because the Poles had, rationalized the eventual that the pike would have completely disappeared in half of a century from the battlefields. Pikes basically remained in some small proportion up to the beginnings of the 18th century on a regular basis. Then you find pikemen also, I don't know, during the French Revolutionary Wars, because still the pike was better than nothing if you didn't have muskets, if you were particularly poor. But generally speaking, by the 18th century, the pikes have disappeared from the battlefield. So my suggestion is that in this extremely dynamic and warfare of Eastern Europe, even deploying this thickly packed formation of pikemen had been, since the very beginning, less, a less frequent needs than it was actually in the West. In Eastern Europe, it was much more a matter. Warfare was much more a matter of cavalry, of mobility. So even these musketeers could be faster, whereas the pikemen have to stick together. They have to advance slowly, etc. So that's why probably dragoons abandoned pikes completely, seemingly from the mid of the 17th century, when pikes were still used in the West, albeit declining. As we've seen, dragoons could fight both on horseback and on foot, although they were always kind of considered part of the infantry rather than of the cavalry, at least from a Polish perspective. But seemingly, in my opinion, were mostly horsemen on the contrary. So it would be interesting also here to understand what was really the deal. By 1710, an author named Karwicki noted that the dragoon, though riding on a horse, in the old manner, fights on foot. So this is actually the deal of the dragoons. Dismounting and fighting on foot. This is kind of the use. Dragoons are essentially mobile infantry, to tell it all, because cavalry has cavalry is an arm that cannot defend. If a cavalry is idling, it cannot defend. It's in a terrible position to defend if you are on horseback. If you want to defend, either you counterattack, so you pass on the attack as well, either you dismount. So in such these enormous open spaces of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, having such mobile infantry that reached one point on horseback so very speedily, very effectively, in seizing that position, then dismounting to protect it, was evidently very, very important. So that was really the deal. But these were, however, still equally skilled horsemen, even if they evolved eventually increasingly more towards, and they had always been practically also about being cavalry. There was still the idea that their chief use, their old manner, like the source says, was actually being to fight as infantry. So passing to the artillery, also in here Poland was a bit lagging behind, at least up to a certain point compared to Western Europe. So like it happened for the greatest part of Eastern Europe, actually artillery and siege fortifications were something that were developed by Italian engineers. This was it was so. The Eastern monarchies were quite interested about the developments of the military developments of the Renaissance, so they hired these Western engineers who also who came there casting cannons, building up fortresses. Think about the Kremlin, it was built by Italian architects and all, because those regions of Europe were less developed, and they needed these new up-to-date technologies that they didn't have. Essentially the social fabric for having on their own. And even though in relatively to Polish artillery, even if these cannons were largely staffed by foreigners, many of the guns were actually cast in Poland in itself. So this is also normal. These engineers came from other areas of Europe and they built cannons in there. There was, however, some improvement that also came in artillery technology from Poland in herself. For instance, the Grand Duke of Lithuanian, Batory, who ruled from 1576 to 1586, so we are here in the late 16th century, previously from our times. It was credited by contemporary sources with the invention of so-called fiery bullets that were especially extremely useful during the Muscovite campaigns between 1579 to 1582. So this was basically incendiary ammunition. It was created by wedding, by making a wedding of sand or ashes, followed by moist greenery to prevent the preheated ball from igniting the power charge. So this basically produced this fire that could be used mostly to burn up everything more than making it to smash or to explode. And this was, you have to imagine naturally how Eastern Europe could be at the end of the 16th century, everything built in wood practically. So this was pretty useful, especially in the Muscovite environments, let's say. And but the greatest development of artillery during the 17th century actually occurred during the reign of Vladislav IV Vasa, who was king from 1632 to 1648. So in first 5 years of reign, Vladislav imposed, he basically reformed the artillery. He imposed a new tax, the so-called dupla, or also called as new quarter, that was aimed at bringing Polish artillery and engineers up to the Western standards. So this backwardness had been felt, and it was an investment by the state to fill that gap, which is quite interesting. So the artillery basically was divided in two branches: the Lithuanian one and the Crown artillery, let's say. And also new officers, new generals of artillery were appointed. The most famous one was Krzysztof Arciszewski, I believe that's the name in Polish, who held this office for 4 years, if I'm not wrong, and Marcin Kacki, that instead came a bit later. And in the end of the 17th century, and the interesting part is that Kacki had served with the Grand Condé in France, so he had taken part to these. He had received like some of the best schools of the time. By the way, Poland had a pretty interesting bond with France in many times of its history, both with the Angevin dynasty, then the Valois, and so there were these exchanges with the West. They were also pretty consistent. So at this point, the Poles begin to create lots of guns. And the place of honor naturally was won by the largest ones, and there were actually these two series of 12 demi-cartons. So these were 24 pounders. We're talking about a caliber of roughly 150 millimeters. So these were actually pretty big guns, and they all were named just like in the West. You know, the biggest guns all had a particular name on their own, just to stress the fact how they were still unique pieces. So we are in the modern era, but in still, you know, there is nothing like standardization proper, at least up to a certain point. This time it was mostly the French that were developing artillery, and also here you can understand the influence that the France had in part in this development of Polish artillery as well, through Katsky and his experience in France. So actually the 24 pounder caliber is the you know, it was the most widespread. It was I mean, it was not the most widespread because there were few actually, but I mean, it was pretty much universal between into Europe between the 17th and 19th century. These things could weigh up to 2.5 tons. They were usually manned by 12 and 1 powder boy. So there were actually, think a bit about the logistical costs also, not just the costs of production, but what it means for an army to actually carry these guns. And naturally there were also smaller guns of several sizes. So in here also nothing standardized, and dimensions that could really vary, and performances that could really vary a freaking lot. Actually, forgot to say also the Swedes had pioneered part of the artillery developments at this time. Also, they were specializing in, the Swedes were great exporters now of iron. They were with those money that were financing their own army and also these technological improvements. So by 1654, so this is after Vladislav IV, but Poland had the Commonwealth was distributed 600 guns throughout all the whole Commonwealth. So it's not a few, really. This was objectively a very large state. Now, in the 17th century, it was already partly declining, but at least their armored forces were extremely effective still. And in the 50s of the 17th centuries, usually field guns were attached to infantry, say squadrons or other units, and deployed normally in the intervals of the battle line. This is what the Swedes did. So at this time, actually, Poland and Sweden were pretty close in many ways, and therefore there were these hybrids in tactics and other models. So the artillery grew obviously in importance throughout the period, especially during the second half of the 17th century, and for this reason the Poles attached to artillery certain guards called either free companies. These were usually dragoons, as we have seen before. These were the units that were attached also to other let's say freely attached to other units. And in 1673 it was created a whole regiment of artillery to provide actually not just protection but also additional muscle power to the artillery. And there was probably also some uniformity in these regiments, because of, you know, to stress their dedication to that task of manning and protecting artillery. The similar things were actually done in France, were being done in the French army of Louis XIV in the same period. So once again, the Western influence and the relations between Poland and France probably were there. So I would like to pass actually to the so-called Royal Guard, or also known as Court Army. That was basically the bulk of, especially in terms of quality, of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth armed forces. So this army was raised independently of the state's army. So Poland had, like all the other countries historically, this say national levy, for which theoretically every with different you know, levels of political bargaining, theoretically all the subjects, all the free able men had to serve in some fashion to contribute to the state's army. And this army, the Royal Guard, was paid by the king's household treasury. So this was a bit of a, in fact, the court army, of the king's private army, if you want. And it's interesting because in times of peace, there was a sort of permanent, Royal Guard. So we are in times to which the states began to create this permanent professional armies. And in peacetime, seemingly the Royal Guard counted no more than 1,200 men, and then obviously in times of war this would be enlarged. So the Royal Guard was composed of several corps that we're gonna list, about which we don't know singularly this great much. So Poland, as we've seen, was quite powerful and quite wealthy also by certain standards, but it wasn't this world that left so many sources already at the time compared to the West. So sometimes we are told about their military developments by Western observers who went there to see the Polish army and referred and wrote about it. This is a bit like just it happened with the Ottoman Empire and other, say, generally geographically Eastern powers that the Westerners came in contact with. So the most important corps of the Royal Guard was the Draban Guard and the King's Retainers. So the Drabans were essentially the guardsmen and made up the excuse me, the King's personal bodyguards. So their equipment could really vary. Sometimes they were named as in Latin stipatores. That stresses etymologically the fact that we're stuck together, and they figured in this sense as halberdiers. Others were called in Polish arcercy, I believe, that is archers, or more commonly they were named as drabans. And in the 80s of the 16th century, an Italian author says that these men were counted 150 halberdiers, whereas in the 30s of the 17th century we know that the Draban Guard was very, very close to the Reiter, that is the German cavalry, and so much that in fact they were called Drabant Reiters. And so this stresses the fact that there was a shift between, you know, the times, and these troops were you know, variedly organized, and they underwent certain modifications over time. By 1663, 1664, They counted about 1,000 soldiers and divided into essentially 6 very large squadrons, and they seem to have been in fact cavalry men mostly by that time. Another corps was the Court Hussar banner. So this was a bit like it was made up of young Polish noblemen, and it was all about cavalry essentially. Also here the organics could vary from 100 to 1,000 horses, and this had to be a magnificent unit. It was really the cream of the Polish nobility. So all these very strong, fit young men, equipped with the most expensive weapons and gear and clothes. So these were a bit the pride of the Polish nobility that fought for the sovereign. In this relatively, in fact, I can say small unit, but I mean they were very elite. So also the numbers weren't that great thing. And then there were the Royal Foot Guards, and this was interestingly a German infantry regiment. Could vary here between the 600 and 1200. We know that by the 30s of the 17th century, these troops were composed by half pikemen and half musketeers, and they had their own blue uniforms of Western pattern, aligned with yellow, and these colors are evidently, a hint at the Swedish ones, because just like the colors of most uniforms of the Polish Vasa King's guards, they were an allusion to the claim over the Swedish throne, and the Swedish flag is blue and yellow still today. So also in here an important Western contribution, a whole German regiment in the Royal Army. Then by the from we think the 30s of the 17th century, we have a regiment of dragoons. Then was another corps made up of called the light cavalry. These were usually light armored hussars that were progressively Polish at the beginning, that were progressively substituted with Tartars and Cossacks, and they wore a red uniform. Concerning uniforms, this is a moment in history into which the modern concept of uniforms kicks in. It was the Swedes are credited for the first time towards the end of the 30 Years' War to have created a uniform proper. So these uniforms were usually issued by the state usually bought the cloth, and also with a certain color, and then it was given to the troops, and the troops would basically sew their clothes on their uniforms on their own, or had them obviously prepared by some artisan, some craftsman. So also in here it wasn't just a matter, it was not really the concept of a modern uniform that is really all alike, done in industrial quantity and model. The most important thing was actually the color to be recognized on the battlefield. So even the fashion of the cloth could vary a little bit. But what is interesting here is that this light cavalry was even within the royal court was made up by Tartars and Cossacks rather than Poles. So another component of the royal guard was the Hungarian Haiduk infantry. So I don't know if you know about the Haiduk. It's essentially these. It would be a peasant irregular infantry that was present in Central and Southeast Europe from the 17th to the 19th centuries. So these and also had naturally older roots. So these were actually, there was actually scum to tell it all. These were bandits or freedom fighters. I mean, the Eastern world, and especially because of this continuous contact with Eastern nomads and this very fluid ethnical divisions and political instability, had really all these raiders and brigands flourishing in the area. These were considered in the Eastern, especially the Balkans, were you considered at the time like the birthplace of robbers and of thieves and of raiders, pillagers and all. Because objectively, there were such bands being hired. It could vary from locals, Slavic populations, to these Eastern Steppes peoples that were, and the Polish made extensive use of such troops. So this was Hungarian infantry. It was in fact brought by when the Voivode of Transylvania, Báthory, became Grand Duke of Lithuania. So he was possibly and quite likely the first sovereign of the Commonwealth to use Haiduks in his guard because of his origin. And actually, we know that so these corps could really vary. Not every king had the same troops and that we have listed. Actually, we find other Haiduks under Sigismund III Vasa, who ruled into Poland between 1587 to 1632, who had in turn actually about 400 Haiduks. They were divided in two companies, one blue and one red, which probably suggests also some kind of uniformity. And only one of these companies was actually made up by Hungarians. So sometimes you find these ethnical names, as we've seen, the Cossacks, the Haiduks, etc., or even the German infantry, German cavalry. But as a matter of fact, not all of these actually were from that specific ethnicity. It was mostly a matter of the prestige of the unit, the tradition of the unit, and the esprit de corps that eventually was absorbed by the people who joined that, and that only had by name this ethnical origin. So just like other guards in the West, like in France or in the Papal States, you could find the Swiss and other Western guards. The Italian author Guagnini mentions that in 1574 the newly elected king of Poland, Henri III of Valois of France, of the French, he was king of France and Poland, arrived in Poland taking with him, as it would be normal for a French king, by the way, as well as any other French nobleman, a bodyguard of 40 Walloons, of Walloon musketeers, by the way, and 60 Swiss halberdiers. So by the time there was a pretty average composition. You see that the halberds were now even in more than the gunners, and these were, you have to imagine, at this time it's a bit, if you have present the Swiss guards of the Pope today, these baggy Plauderhosen dresses with paneled in yellow and other colors. Henry's ones were seemingly were yellow and green silks dresses, and so these contacts between Poland and France kept going on. Even during the 18th century. Think about the marriage between, and the excuse me, I was saying that there were other French noblemen, including some former captains of the French Royal Guard, who actually
came to Poland during the time of the Sun King. So I can't help but being extremely fascinated by this, because you can understand really this blending of knowledge and military tradition that could happen through such individuals that were in fact coming there as not just as political figures, but also as military advisors. The Westerners now were being exported as military advisors, especially the French ones of the Louis XIV army, in literally everywhere, even into the Ottoman Empire. You find many Frenchmen there that converted to Islam and went serving the Sultan, because there was a profitable job offer. And especially after the end of the 30 Years' War, was this overproduction crisis, so that so many of these advisors remained without employment and went into the Ottoman Empire together with Western weaponry and powder, etc. Then, talking about the Ottomans, what is interesting here, a bit of spicy, of exotic thing, is that the Royal Guard of Poland had janissaries and sekbands, as a matter of fact, in it. So these were actually small units of janissaries, dressed in fact in Turkish style. You have to think that Westerners at this time were literally obsessed by Turkish culture. The greatest, these, think about the Poles, the Germans, the Italians, they were all fighting against the Ottoman Empire. And they were so fascinated by this terrible foe, and it was a normal thing for the European noblemen to have to gift each other with extremely pricey weapons and armors made on in Ottoman style. And in fact, if you go into these splendid armories of Central Europe, you find lots of this stuff, and some of them were also naturally praise of war, that is Turkish equipment that had been captured in war, and was this great interest, so that in fact you see here the Polish sovereign had even his own janissaries in style to show that he could also fill them if he wanted. Now that was also a political shout out to say, look at that, we can't have janissaries too, so Sublime Gate, you're not the only one. So these guys had all their by the way, these small Turkish units were also created by the same Polish wealthy magnates in their private armies that now we will be going to discuss. So it's pretty cool, because you understand that this was a pretty transversal thing, and you can find it even up to the end of the 18th century. So something very very late, very that kept existing for a very long time. The what else can we talk about? Oh yeah, we're talking about private armies. So now we have stopped talking about the royal army, and this was like the bulk that the sovereign fielded a bit for himself. You know that the greatest concern for the modern sovereigns was creating a regular army that could be in this sense faithful to the state and hence to the monarchy. It was something very costly, and the whole modern state was built, as a matter of fact, because of these military needs. But the nobility, especially in these very still, say, feudally minded areas like in Eastern Europe, where the nobility, where the bourgeoisie of the West did not really exist in great numbers. The most dynamic ethnical components of Eastern Europe were sometimes, in fact, Westerners themselves. Take the Germans, who were usually merchants, and in fact were also quite rich, and these Eastern monarchies looked upon those communities to draw money, etc. But while the rest of the local nobility, ethnic nobility, was a bit of a more traditionalist, and there was still this idea of the knight, the lord, the fief, and and the rest was mostly peasantry. So the main problem was that the nobles were definitely powerful. Now, we don't have the time to make a history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but let's say that eventually by the 18th century this system goes declining, politically speaking, because of the fact that, in fact, the Polish crown was not that centralized. So the Polish made a lot of improvements also in institutional terms by stressing this equality, this autonomy. The Polish constitution also inspired in a certain way and predated the American and the French constitutions a little bit. There were lots of Poles that during the partition of Poland in the late 18th century went fighting for the Americans during the American War of Independence. There was a lot of that because the Poles really felt this, let's say, egalitarian form, and then obviously in reality it was just the noblemen, the aristocrats, that wanted to control that, but it was still pretty egalitarian from those times. Standards was actually pretty more, and as a consequence, though, these Polish aristocrats were quite autonomous and could raise very large bodies of very large private armies, as a matter of fact, even in larger quantity, in larger numbers than the same king's army. It was pretty upsetting for central power, as you can imagine. So all these Polish magnates could rise armies numbering anything up to 10,000 men. And on many occasions the Polish private armies actually, as we said, outnumbered the combined strength of the quarter army, so the levy, general levy, and the royal guard put together. This is pretty serious. In 1632, we know that at a royal election in Poland, the Bishop of Plock, very important center, his name was Stanislaw Lubieński, had an escort of 1,000 dragoons, 2,000 infantry, and 10 guns. So a little and not so little army on his own. So you can really imagine, how difficult it could be politically and military to deal with these aristocracies. Naturally, you have to imagine all these magnates really clashing against each other. So they were actually, that's also partly why the Polish armies were so, they had such a high quality, because there was a kind of ongoing warfare with someone. If it wasn't with the foreigners, it was between the same Polish or Lithuanians. So the military average was kept relatively up. But as eager as these aristocrats were to fight against each other or to resist the centralistic pushes of the monarchy, they were somewhat more hesitant, let's say, to in fact assist the same monarchy and to field armies at his demand. And this was done, as many times in history, only when objectively the whole Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was in danger, or maybe because those that aristocrat lived into a region of the Commonwealth that had been that was threatened by by the Swedes or by the Ottomans or by other powers. And so this the interaction, say the service that owed to the state was usually usually these magnates were not paid by the monarchy for their military service. Unless they obtained commissions to levy troops as part of the state army. So when the quarter army was called, the king wrote signed these letters of commission, for which they rose not much differently of how it was happening in the West, to be honest. So the monarchy gave money to raise certain armies, however, it could easily happen that these troops were raised also without payment, and that these nobles would be rewarded by the king at discretion, either with land or with certain titles. So this was done pretty much all over Europe at this point, so that these guys simply obtained some, political or economical gain, and they would arm their the armies for the state on their own. So as you understand, this wasn't really a good recipe for these armies being faithful to central power. This is a bit how it happened, I don't know, in Germany with Wallenstein, that switched sides, wanted to become king of Germany, and this was really the time of these great businessmen of war, that were at the same time businessmen and good military commanders. But we don't have to underestimate in this sense also the quality of the equipment, because if you were a pretty ambitious aristocrat, you could field a hell of an army to obtain even more than what you were promised by the king. So there was, however, sort of fixed and standard. There were certain, specifically 4 families of magnates in Poland that had to provide military contributions by law. So they were obliged to do that, as a matter of fact, by the Sejm. The Sejm was the Polish-Lithuanian parliament, or diet, as you want to call it. So these families were, these families' properties were ordained, let's say, by the parliament to, in order to prevent dispersion. So the estates of these families were controlled in a way that they couldn't be mutated in something else, to be sold. To remain concentrated on the, in this sense, on the Polish soil, and in order to provide, and this was done also interfering with the patrimonial strategies of these families, because the parliament basically ensured and enforced by law that these properties were all passed to the single eldest son, so they didn't go split, and they could remain under a single organizer for facilitating the logistical organization. And by 1589 we have an example of from 1589 and from 1609, but what these families had to deploy. So from 1589 the Zamoyski ordination had to provide 200 men, the Radziwill 6,000. So these are all names of Polish aristocrats. From 1601, the Gonzaga Miskowski, 150 men. Also here it's interesting how they intermarried with the Gonzaga, that were these Italian aristocratic family. So you have to think really a lot of exchange also among the military aristocracy of Europe, of many different traditions, and the aristocratic marriages at this time were extremely international at the time. From 1609, sorry, I thought it was just the 1589. It said there are also other years. So from 1609, the Ostrogski family had to field 6,000 men. And these ordinations also issued to maintain certain fortresses scattered throughout the Commonwealth for the defense of the country. As for many other noblemen in Europe, obviously also the Poles had their own, every Polish aristocratic family had its own colors. So there were certain liveries, these, and unfortunately we don't know very much about that. It's also a very picturesque side of warfare that was naturally obfuscated to show also the wealth of the single family and it was actually a pride to be able to field a large army on your own and to say, this is my family. And you have to think it to be a very big investment. Pillaging was usually the best way to to be compensated for the military expenses. So these Polish aristocrats, like the other European nobility, considered war chiefly as a business, and the organization of these private armies as a mean to make a lot of money through the revenues of war. And that's why also Europe at the time was so deeply devastated. And think of Germany during the 30 Years' War, because a war was considered as a sort of party to go raiding altogether, so nothing more, nothing less in practice. Well, of course, it's more complicated, but really you don't have to underestimate this side. And as I said before, if you're interested to know a bit more about that, I just made a video about the Dragoon Guard that tells it all pretty eloquently, telling the truth. So as we were saying in the beginning, the Polish winged Hussars were the cream of the backbone as well of these Polish private armies, and they were essentially raised not much differently from how it had been done since the end of the Middle Ages. Like the recruitment forms were quite similar to the ones of the French Bandé of Ordonnance. So there was a commission to rise certain troops, and the organizer would take that and on him at his own expenses, and so it was. And usually these units were called bands that were in turn a group of rota in Polish, rota, which comes from the French route or the German rot. So this was, you understand how European was the military vocabulary, and there was a frank language in this sense. And the rota corresponded to a company substantially. And what is interesting about these rotas of winged hussars is that their captain was called in Polish rotmistrz, I believe, which is nothing less but the Rotmeister from the German vocabulary, and usually just like in the West. Polish, it was pretty transversal in terms of military organization. The Rotmistrz was a nobleman. So these were the guys who had the money to invest in such enterprises. It was no less than a business. Okay. So there were also other entities into the Polish Commonwealth that could field autonomous armies. Naturally, every city back at the time had a sort of military organization, but urbanism wasn't that huge into Eastern Europe. There were mostly certain cities that had developed usually from other people's communities, such as Gdansk in Polish, Danzig in German. There was definitely the wealthiest land of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This city was so rich at the time that it basically could defend itself throughout its own militia without the help of the king. The Dutch merchants that sailed in there were amazed by the weaponry and artillery arsenals that Danzig had. No, well, I can say I don't want to repeat Gdansk or Danzig every time. I say Danzig because it's it's mostly usually done like this in English, so don't take it as I'm not making a nationalist point on it at all. And by 1646, Danzig could field a militia of 6,000 men. That was split in 5 regiments by 12 companies each. So each company was roughly a 100 men, in a regiment 1,200. And every regiment was identified by was named actually through a color. There was the orange one, black one, etc. Even though from at least the evidence that we have, we don't see a lot of color uniformity. These were still militias, so they kind of equipped a bit as they fancied, and they were pretty Western looking in equipment, in clothing more than else. Equipment was pretty standard at the time for every. And this is kind of a Danzig achieved also certain military feats in this sense on its own. So think even about the having such a powerful city in your own lands. I mean, as we know, centralization was still poor at this time, so it was a sort of state within the state, and that's how the Ancien Regime was actually conceived. There were certain social stands that made up sort of states on their own. As a matter of fact, you see in France, where all the 3 states later. And for instance, Danzig held out against the Grand Duke Bathory during its revolt, the revolt of the same Danzig, and no one managed basically to penetrate her defenses. And in the 20s of the 17th century, Danzig resisted alone against not just an everyday army or commander, but no one else but the Gustavus Adolphus Swedes, that at the time were the most advanced army and most powerful army in Europe. So this also triggered certain strategical consequences, because if Gustavus Adolphus had not underestimated Danzig's resilience, probably even the history of Europe would have gone in a different way, because with his army he could have achieved a lot without Danzig's obstacle. Now, a very important part of the Polish armies at this time that we haven't talked about were actually made by the Tartars and the Cossacks. So that if you look at the political geography of the political map, political geography sounds really bad in some way. No, well, it's just me that I hate the word geopolitics, because as a matter of fact it doesn't mean anything. Everybody, all the journalists fill their mouths with geopolitics as if that was something, oh, cool, who knows what those people think. Geopolitics doesn't exist, just to be pretty radical in to tell you what I think. And I promise I will explain this in one of my videos one day, but but if you look at the political map of Europe, that is more accurate, you realize that southeast of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth you have the Crimea and the Black Sea, and that was the area where there was the Crimean Khanate. So these were basically the descendants of the Golden Horde. At this time, this was a sort of vassal state of the Ottomans. That because the Ottomans invaded Crimea back in the day and kicked out the Golden Horde to the east, but these were still pretty autonomous lands, and was these were enemies both of the Russians and of the Poles. I mean, there is all of history. Eventually, Peter the Great fought for Crimea, for having an access on the Black Sea, etc. But that's another story for another time. And these were tendency, so these were they were these Ottoman allies most of the time. So they were enemies of the Christian powers in the north. They were Islamic. And they could field. I mean, Poland fought pretty extensively against the Tartars at this time, and sometimes in the sources you find written that the Tartars had hundreds of thousands of troops, and you said, that's an exaggeration. Up to a certain point, but actually the armies that could be fielded by these guys were pretty large. Also because they weren't much probably in terms of quality. I mean, they were pretty effective as well from a tactical point of view, but these numbers are so big because they were, in this sense, very big raiding parties of every single cavalryman who could join. So they didn't have such an extremely developed and ordered structure and discipline like the Western armies. But they were still very difficult enemies to meet. Yet, at the same time, as it happens, especially in these political formations that do not have a great stability, you understand that many of these clans of Tatars that lived into Eastern Europe sometimes sided, as a matter of fact, with the same Christians. And the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was plenty of them, actually, in its army. It was normal, by the way, for many countries of Eastern Europe, take Hungary or Poland itself, to settle, historically, such large bodies of Tartars in their own lands. This had existed since, even previously to the Mongol invasion proper. This had happened also with with the Cumans, with etc. In 14th century Poland, the Grand Duke Leopold had already settled very wide numbers of Tartars in Poland. This was a measure that was done since the Middle Ages, actually, by by these national monarchies to create a sort of guard against the local nobility. So basically, these nomads were settled in these countries to become a sort of private guard of the king. This was done in Hungary as well, pretty much. And so you have to imagine this world, right, to be very multi-ethnic in many ways. And so this was done also naturally to field an army, because these guys were pretty, they were coming straight from the world of the steppes. They were somewhat wild for Western perspective, but they were pretty good fighters. So until they didn't settle down and mix with the rest of the population, were even easily, usually they were settled into the populated areas. So were especially in areas that resembled a bit more their homelands. So the Hungarian plain was, in this sense, a very good place to stay in the case of Hungary. And because in the first generations they kept carrying out their nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle. It's been estimated that 16th century Lithuania had actually a 200,000 Tartar population, and these guys were Muslims. Actually, they had been converted to Islam since they were coming from these khanates that eventually had created by Mongols, and eventually converted to Islam. And although they worshipped they were Muslims, they spoke Russian or Polish, so they were actually pretty much, even in here, probably many of them were not even descending from the steppes. They were local people who kind of got together with those communities in some ways. It was pretty normal in Eastern Europe. These communities of Tartars were participated to the national levy in some measure. It was really national level. Usually they were bonded, especially in the first times of the settlement, to the local to the local king. It was a sort of personal bond. Then eventually they were framed progressively to the feudal hierarchy, let's say, in terms of military recruitment, etc. And interestingly, still at this time, they were recruited on a decimal base, just like it happened to the Mongolian armies. You know that the Mongolian armies were they had a decimal base of recruitment by tradition. It was a bit the standard. The Poles recruited this. So, by the way, consider how these areas were of Eastern Europe were also, Western Poland, let's say Poland proper, was a bit more westernized. But as long as you went in the east, these were still areas where, nomads and sedentaries lived pretty, together for a very long time, side by side for a very long time. So even the ethnic borders here are pretty blurry, and the actually lifestyle could vary a lot, as we will see it later. For the Cossacks, those were the Zaporozhian Cossacks. Those were mostly Slavs. Actually, they weren't Tartars anymore. They were Slavs who basically joined into the nomadic lifestyle of these peoples. What I was saying, the fact that Poles recruited these guys on certain companies that framed under certain banners that could vary between 60 and 200 men. So there were certain these guys were actually still split into tribes. The major Lithuanian Tatar tribes were the Oisun, the Naiman, the Yalair, the Kongret, and the Barian. And there was this tribal aristocracy of the Uhlans. The Uhlans, also in here, in Western military tradition, the Uhlans came to define a certain type of cavalry that was initially, from as many others actually, think this about the same Hussars. There were actually ethnic contingents that came to define eventually certain types of type of cavalry, practically on the base of its tactical role. But even more interesting, and in their sense, the Tartars really provided huge bodies of troops to the Polish army as well, and they were pretty good, as you can imagine, especially as horsemen, pretty throwaway troops, and they could perform roles that were probably also similar to the one of the Dragoons in some measure, because, by the way, these Tartars, especially in these more western areas, had kind of given up their cultural resistances to the adoption of firearms. And in this sense, they were pretty dynamic. They used every kind of weapon. They were actually great soldiers. And up to World War II, actually, especially that was about the Cossacks, but there were many mounted contingents in here on the Eastern Front. Both the Soviets and the Nazis actually fielded certain units of these, chiefly Cossacks, actually, and not Tartars proper. And now we explain actually the difference, because another major component, a very important component of the Polish forces were the so-called Zaporozhian Cossacks. And I'm sorry for the pronunciation, because I found it anglicized as Zaporozhian, while I knew that this is a Ukrainian locality called Zaporizhzhia. I believe it's the same, but I stick to Zaporozhian because I found it written. Sorry if I didn't document myself. So what were these Zaporozhian Cossacks? Well, so the Cossacks, originally speaking, weren't different from the really from the Tartars. As such, you have to think of the Eastern world. I made lots of videos about this, of these Eastern Eurasian steppes, and sometimes we want to split between Indo-Europeans and Turks in a very easy way. As a matter of fact, these were extremely mixed. There were certain Turks that these were mostly ethnical names, but genetically speaking, they could be very, very mixed. So that some Turks were blonde even before, settling into Turkey, for instance, because they came from these peoples of the Saka, of the Aryans, that dwell in there, and these populations were so homogeneous that they intermixed. I mean, pretty intensively, historically speaking. So the Cossacks' ethnical origins can be found into these various nomadic peoples, including the Tartars, the Circassians, and the Kipchaks. But it's not even that important, as a matter of fact. What is important is how they were defined and what they were at the time we are discussing. So by the 16th century, they were usually referred as the Tatar Cossacks. And it was also used, the term of Kazakh was also used. But by the Tatars actually, these were interchangeable terms. Like Kazakh and Tatar, for instance, could be used in both ways. It all depends on what these peoples, the people called them, independently from their ancient ethnonym, about which we know very few, by the way, in its origins and linguistical origins. But I mean, how were they formed more than what it strictly means in their language. But what is important is these Zaporozhian Cossacks inhabited beyond. That is the name of the region. Actually, Zaporoi in the local language means beyond the cataracts. So the cataracts here have to be meant the ones of the Dnieper River. And these guys lived actually within the islands of the Dnieper River. So these were a bunch. It's actually difficult to define who they practically were, because most of these. So you understand, was this original Tatar Turkic element. They settled down, but huge quantity of people, of local peoples, joined them. Most of these Cossacks, as a matter of fact, were Ukrainians. They stuck to Cossack language and tradition, but they were ethnic Slavs, genetically at least. But what I find extremely fascinating about this is that these were sort of, I don't know how to say, of brigands, of pirates, and actually were a pretty consistent community. And in fact, if you read the Polish registers in the military service at the beginning of the 17th century, you realize there are 10,000 names registered, and they were hired by the Poles in regiments of varying in size and strength from 100 to 50 people. And what is really interesting about these guys is that, so I don't know if you have ever read stories about them. There are also very funny anecdotes, but these were pretty bold, fierce, and unruly people. Very violent as well. But if you really curbed them with pretty harsh discipline, they could become excellent soldiers. As a matter of fact, they were pretty keen on raiding, and also one of the greatest problems of these Eastern European powers is that they like to use these Eastern nomads in their ranks, but they use them mostly as pillagers, because most of the times weren't even paid proper. They just were rewarded with loot. What they were masters in. So in fact, during the battle, sometimes they even abandoned their ranks to go loot in the enemy camps. So this caused many problems. Also in warfare, there have been lots of battles that have gone in another way, because these guys wanted to do what the hell they wanted. So very wild in their mindset. But it was really interesting is that these plunderers were not just a a community like all the others. And in living in these islands, they were sort of isolated community. And the Italian author Gamberini notes in 1506 that defines these Zaporozhian Cossacks as desperate men who he actually talks about people who were joining these Cossacks. And these people were desperate men who, having committed various excesses, could not live securely elsewhere, and came from as far as Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, basically to live with those guys. So it's as if this had been a cove of pirates, of people, of renegades, of people who in the West had had troubles with justice, that they had debts, they had to escape, they went ruined, and people living in Germany and Spain, or what I do, I go to join the Zaporozhian Cossacks, and they went there. So they converted to their traditions, they started living with them, and that's how they were formed. So this is very important, because here it's an Italian author noticing, so there were French, Italians, so this thing was known at the time, evidently. So just to say even how the world is small in many ways, that sometimes as Westerners we say, oh yeah, that happened in Eastern Europe, I don't care, it's in our, this was actually next door. and people and I get very sensitive about this, because I think that Eastern European history is extraordinarily beautiful. And aside from the fact that most actually Eastern Europeans are Westerners, contrarily wise to what the Cold War has set us in our mind, etc., they have beautiful histories. Today, I must confess, I was extremely happy to talk about the Polish army in the 17th century, because, and I will keep doing that, by the way. Recently I made a video also about medieval Polish armies, as I was saying before, and this happened completely randomly, so I don't have a particular, preference for Poland at this time. It's just I think everything is interesting, and this one is very, very cool, and that things get interesting as long as you learn about them, because if you don't know anything about certain things, you can't even understand whether they're interesting or not. Most of the times people say I'm not interested. It's because they don't actually know, that they fear the unknown. This is typical. This is a typical human behavior, that you tend to put away what you do not know. Once you know it, you totally love that, because you know you can master that. And I must confess that myself, I don't know much about Eastern European history. At least compared to the knowledge I have about Western Europe, and I really I feel bad about this, because it's so stupid actually, and I wish I knew much more, and unfortunately at this moment I don't have but these occasions to actually know a bit more about these topics, but in the future I will surely try to read as much as I can, because in the specific case of Polish military history, there is a freaking lot to tell about it. Poland had an amazing military at this time. As I said before at the very beginning of the video, I'm sorry that I haven't been talking about specifically about the winged Hussars. I managed to say something, but even that chapter would deserve a 2.5-hour video on its own, because they were one of the most amazing units that existed in history, one of the most effective ones, so it's plenty of things to tell. And I'm sorry also I don't expand very much into modern warfare at this point. I'm kind of doing it, but it's rare, and mostly about the Middle Ages, but I think in the future, especially when I will have exhausted a bit the general medieval history topics, I will get more thoroughly also, I will expand more into modern warfare. It will be at that point all about warfare, telling the truth. Also in the Napoleonic age, Napoleonic era, sorry, and beyond, because this channel was born essentially for military history. Now I'm talking about certain general history especially about the Middle Ages, because I want to make mass, and it's easy for me as a medievalist to talk about that, but I'm telling the truth, much more in love with military history proper, of the whole history. So my dream is eventually to talk about lots of things also in here about the whole military history, and so I hope I will manage to do that. So, will I come back on this topic soon? Unfortunately not, at least I don't think so, because I really do these things, I really choose these topics randomly. So, most of the times I don't know what I have to talk about before, 2 days, the day in which I will do it. So, I can't really tell you. I could come back talking about Polish military history this very month, or I don't know, maybe in several months. So I don't really know. The only thing I know is that if I keep doing these videos every day, that will go faster. But there is so much to talk about. My next videos now will be either about Frederick Barbarossa and the Byzantine army again. So it's yeah, if you're interested, just stick around. And for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Most of all, I did. It's one of those videos that I like doing, but some others I don't, because I can't express myself. Instead, here it was pretty interesting. And if you did like it, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or a dislike if I deserve a dislike. And otherwise subscribe to my channel, because that's basically just you receiving notifications about my upcoming videos. So if you're interested in them, that might be a good idea. For now, I just, as always, thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.